My name is Tony Jordan. I'm a partner at EY, where I serve as the America's leader for the Forensic and Integrity Services practice, which means I oversee our services for North America, Central America, and South America. So there've been a number of changes. I think the one that really, hits up front and that I've seen routinely is just, how have companies pivoted to make sure that they're getting the information that they need to do their compliance testing effectively in the current environment. And what that's meant is, people having to do that work remotely, whereas in the past, for a US based company that has global operations, for example, there might have been a tendency to have a team out of the US traveling around the globe doing certain kinds of compliance testing and monitoring and so on. And if you look at today's environment where people really aren't able to travel due to the pandemic and so on, there's a need to figure out a new way to do that. And so how do you make sure that you're getting the information to get the full picture of compliance, and so that things can be effective along the way? Yeah, I think there are a couple key things. One, there's more of a focus on the data capabilities. And as you think about working remotely, really trying to find a way is what are the best tools, the latest tools to capture the right data to give you insights into whether your compliance is effective or not. That is really first and foremost. The other thing really is, okay, if I can't have people traveling all over the place and certain things that I may need from a local perspective, how do I continue to do that? Do I need to look to a third party that has people on the ground, so that I'm able to get the information that I need, should this, God forbid, occur again, something like this in the future. So really, to me, it is, one, thinking about data and your data capabilities, and then two, thinking about whether this is something that you really can do internally, or you need to think about getting some third party support or staffing up your organization in a different way, because some of it may be, instead of jumping to a third party, because I don't want people to think that I'm, selfishly trying to promote our business. Maybe I do need people on the ground in some of those foreign locations, particularly where I have a higher level of risk. And not all companies have done that in the past. The mental health is obviously extremely important. We've seen people struggle with that, whether that's in our organization or some of our clients along the way. And being mindful of that is extremely important in making sure that people get the help that they need and that you've got support networks for those types of things. That all being said, compliance is compliance. And I feel like the accountability needs to be the same, frankly. I don't think you need less or more accountability. The key question to me is, are there things that you've had to do as an organization to adapt to the work from home or remote capabilities and so on that have changed your risk landscape? And therefore, do you need to pivot to make sure that you're looking at compliance in a different way and covering those risks? To me, that's the bigger issue. I think the accountability absolutely needs to be the same. You need to have a culture of compliance and have that level of accountability that lines up with that. To me, it's a question of, okay, how do we pivot if we need to, based on additional risks that may be out there? Yeah, that's a really interesting one, and I guess fortunately for me, unfortunately, I've been doing this for a long time, and you can see it from the gray in my beard here. But as you look at the what's happened over the last several years, I remember early on in my career, we would be on the ground for every investigation, sitting on site with large teams. And over the past several years, you've seen a tendency for a number of companies to say, do I really want this entire investigation team on the ground for my people to see and constantly ask questions as to what's going on, and cause some morale issues within the entity? And for that reason, we really have shifted quite a bit to doing these investigations remotely, even before the pandemic. And so I feel like we were pretty well set up to do those things, and a lot of companies the same. The hardest part really is, how do you deal with interviews and things like this? We're on a platform today where we're doing this via the web and video. Some of that has gotten better because the technology is better, but it's still hard to really replace that, face-to-face live interaction with somebody and getting a sense of their body language and how they're responding to a situation, and putting documents in front of them and so on. And so really the question is, how do you change your habits to effectively interview from a video format and so on when you are having to do that remotely? That's the biggest thing for me. For us, again, for our organization, and this is something that perhaps, and I talked about to your point earlier a little bit. For us, we have over the years, again, if I go back in time, if I go back 10, 15 years ago, I had an investigation and it was in Belgium. I would be on the ground in Belgium doing that work. So I think us and a lot of the other providers has shifted to use our global networks more so, and utilizing them. So, my teams aren't going to Belgium so often. We would get a team in Belgium to help with that. And it really is helpful because you've got somebody on the ground who understands the business customs and other things that are really helpful to have your arms around. And companies need to think about it the same way. If they have a high risk location, should they have people on the ground there that can help them effectively do investigations, compliance, and so on, as I said earlier. If you think about all the data that's available to you, and you think about some of the tools that are really being more widely utilized today, and certainly something that we focus on, if you do it the right way, you can make your compliance program so much more effective. And so, one, again, just looking what data is available to me to think creatively and innovatively about how do I get my arms around the compliance issue that I'm dealing with today. And so that's one that when we deal with companies all the time, there is an assessment of here is all the data that's available to me and the insights that I might glean from that data. That's highly important when we think about that transformation of how we use technology. The automation piece, obviously, it's just going to get you the information more real time and allow you to monitor things in a much more effective way. And so, whereas in the past, people would try to do things in a much more manual basis, doing some kind of testing, and again, in a much more manual way on a monthly, quarterly, or periodic basis, having something that allows you to use automation to get that up and running more routinely will give you insights to the business if you're using the right data and compliance as you go forward. And so, that in a very general way, without getting into specific types of data and instances, examples of where we've done it, is where I see the most benefit. Yeah, I think what the guidance is very good at is giving you, here's a roadmap to say it's really important. What it's not good at is telling you, here are the steps to do that. And so, no, I think oftentimes, like any amount of regulation around things, companies sometimes struggle with, okay, what does this mean? What is the gold standard or the standard to get it right? And so, I think the best thing that companies can do is be having an open dialogue around these things, talking to their peers, what's working, what isn't working. And that's where, providers like us, and again, the network itself that these companies have, provide them with a platform to get information to say, okay, how are others dealing with this? I don't have to be the first one, and so on, to get their arms around it. I do think that, there is a real opportunity here when companies are setting up different systems to say, well, what kind of information would be helpful to me, and how would I get how would I get my arms around that? And that's something that I don't see people doing as effectively. Oftentimes they're behind the curve and saying, okay, what data is there that I can get versus what data would I want, and can I get that implemented? Yeah, so let me say this. I'll say that number one, the culture within the organization is paramount. And for me, it's like when you take a step back and look at your organization, is a culture one where when times are difficult or you hit a crisis, people are going to cut corners in order to make things happen? Or are they going to continue to stay within the guidelines and focus on the very important compliance and so on, the expected controls to make sure they're doing things the right way? And what's really important is having laid that foundation ahead of time. And so I really want to emphasize that for a second. because it's really hard to shift the culture in the middle of a crisis. So when something's gone wrong, you're going to see the worst behaviors of people. And if you haven't built that strong culture ahead of time and really focused on compliance, particularly during a pandemic when you've got people having to work remotely and so on, it's going to be really hard to fix that. And so that's one where you're just going to, you have to emphasize. And so, if you don't, you risk that you're going to have a disaster on your hands that will, one, be visibly internally, because people internal to the organization are going to see it pretty quickly. And when you look at, today's environment, whether it be the risk of whistleblowers, whether it be social media, and so on, there's a very real risk that that would be visible externally and damage the company's reputation. And so, to me, it is companies really thinking about, one, did I lay the groundwork ahead of time? Two, how do I then make sure I emphasize that now when I'm in a moment of crisis, saying, guys, the rules still apply, right? I should say guys and gals, the rules still apply. And so making sure that there is that continued emphasis on that to make sure that you don't damage your reputation. Because obviously that's your reputation, that's your brand. And the last thing you need is people, looking to leave the company because they're concerned over morale, investors walking away because they're concerned about what kind of reputation they're seeing from some damaging act happen and so on. Management's actions really matter, particularly when things are difficult. And if management's actions, vary widely from the stated culture or intentions, when you think about where we're focused there, there's a perception of a need to make things happen regardless of the rules in place. And the past surveys that we've done, to your point, tell us that oftentimes the junior employees, the ones who are doing the day-to-day activities and responsible for actually effectuating the controls at the end of the day, they oftentimes feel that upper management, who they report to and they're supposed to be holding them accountable, are willing to play outside of the guidelines and outside of the rules. And if you're a board member or some other fiduciary, think about that for a moment and say, if I've got the lower level people who feel like they're being held accountable, not for doing that, but for actually doing something different that goes against my culture, what does that mean? So, it's really important that, there's some assessment of the actions of senior management and that accountability if it's driving things the way that you've intended. It's extremely important. There's a few things there. And if I think about the pandemic in particular, one, it's being very visible as a leader. They're oftentimes, if the people don't hear from you, they feel like, that the person doesn't care. Really important. And I've heard that time and time again in the various conversations that I've had. The second is to really be consistent. And so the things that matter before still matter today. And so when you think about again, emphasizing the culture, emphasizing the need to be compliant and so on, important that you continue to focus on those things to remind people that that's the case. Another thing is just to be steady. You need a steady hand at the helm during a crisis in particular. If people see me on my teams panicking and saying, "Oh my Lord, the pandemic, what are we going to do?" People are going to react to that in a very negative way. And so having a steady hand that again emphasizes the things that are really important, shows that we're steadying the ship and we have a plan in place is extremely important. And I'd say along with all of that, and probably an overused term is just lead. Show people what's important, be willing to use your voice, and focus on the right things. I'd say just to sum it up, I think that while the pandemic is unique, it is indicative of a number of things that we see happen in various crises. And it's just a reminder that, you really need to think about, how do I set myself up for success ahead of time should an event like this happen? Whether it is some major investigation that the company's going to go through, or whether it's a pandemic, God forbid we have another one, and so on. And so really emphasize the need to focus on that culture ahead of time and compliance ahead of time, and then to lead during that event to make sure that you keep the company in the right place.